So let's start off with the next segment of the day, everyone. So again, please rotate tables, try to meet some new folks. We're shifting topics now to the topic of data and platforms in mobility. And so we have a great panel here. And I'm going to, first of all, apologize because we had planned for Sandy Pentland to join us and moderate this panel, and he could do a much better job than I can, but unfortunately there's a conflict. And so I'm going to take over with the help of Esteban Moro. Esteban is a research scientist in the Connection Science Group and a real specialist in mobility data. So the two of us are going to kind of tag team on this panel. We have some great folks with us today. So I'm just going to start out immediately to my left. So Hari Balakrishnan is a professor here at MIT, but also the founder and chief technology officer of a company called Cambridge Mobile Telematics. And so I'm just going to start right off. Hari, tell us a little bit about what Cambridge Mobile Telematics is.
Is the protocol removing the mask?
Yes.
Okay, great.
You can see mask on the panel.
All right, great. Good afternoon. Thank you all for inviting me. So as John said, I'm a professor and also founder and CTO of CMT. It's right down the street on 314 Main. We started about 10 years ago with the mission to make the world's roads and drivers safer. Over the last 10 years, the number of cars on the road has gone up 40%. It's about 1.4 billion vehicles today. It was about 1 billion vehicles when we started the company. And one of the most interesting and impactful things that's happened in our society is, for example, if you look at pedestrian deaths pedestrian deaths or bicycle deaths in the United States from 1990 to 2018, take pedestrian deaths, it started off at some level and came down, and in 2009 it reached a bottom level, which was good, and then it started going back up. And something similar is true for bicycle deaths. And the reason for this, there's lots of theories and reasons for it, but one of the primary reasons for this is that this is very correlated with the rise of smartphones. And it tracks really well the number of active smartphones in use. So phone distractions become pretty significant. So we started this company coming out of research from MIT's Cartel project that I ran with my co-founder and colleague Sam Madden. And our goal was to understand how to take mobile sensing, which was data from mobile sensors and small IoT devices that we built, and try to figure out how to build a business out of it. And we ended up in partnerships with insurance company, rideshare companies, automakers, and cities. In fact, with Boston, and Chris was one of our first programs called Boston's Safest Driver, which the idea was to use a combination of mobile sensing, some statistics and machine learning, and behavioral science to do three things. First, measure how well people are driving using scalable technologies, which are sensors on phones and IoT devices, and now with connected car data. Second, to improve with behavioral science, providing incentives in the form of rewards and leaderboards and social gamification and many of these ideas that can actually make people better drivers, to reduce phone distraction, reduce the amount of at-risk speeding, and other myriad of risk factors. And third, to help if people got into a crash, to do everything from real-time crash assistance to claims processing and claims reconstruction. So the company's growth has been in three phases. The first 5 years, it was really slow. We were quite a bit ahead in terms of what the technology was capable of. We needed to do background processing on iPhones, and iPhones didn't allow that. We just placed a bet that you could do these things. We built a small IoT device and sort of brought it to market originally with a company in South Africa, but now many US insurers use the small 5 centimeter by 5 centimeter device. We've shipped about 21 million of these now. Daily, we have several million users on our technologies. We have about 80 enterprise programs around the world in 20 countries. And in the US, we work with 21 of the top 25 US insurers, and many of the programs with, State Farm's Drive Safe and Save, or Progressive Snapshot, or the smaller insurers like Plymouth Rock has Road Rewards, and so there's many of these programs. So that's kind of where we are. So it's really a company that's motivated by this mission, and we do a lot of work with cities, and we're hoping to continue and do some more interesting things, not only around vehicular safety with automobiles, but other forms of safety as well. And these programs that we did, for example, in Boston, have taught us a lot about behavioral science and what gets people to improve their driving behavior, because you can run these contests and provide data back to users, but also in aggregated form to cities to maybe try to improve some of what how safety works at scale in cities.
And so your customer is, of course, cities, but also insurance companies.
Yeah, our main customer base is our insurance companies, rideshare companies, and increasingly automakers as well. But those would be, and the insurance is mostly personal lines, but also a fair amount of commercial lines as well. With cities, it's really more of a partnership. It's not like it's a revenue for us. It's more important that it be something which raises awareness and publicity for these programs and gets people excited about understanding their driving behavior and improving it. I mean, the reality is, when we've done surveys before, 81% of people say they're well above average drivers.
Yes. Not in this city.
Here it might be 100% would say that. But about 33% would qualify in our scoring as well above average. Right. We also help insurers not only with data collection, but also with filing. So we have our own scores that are built on telematics alone, filed in 48 states and approved by regulators. So insurance companies can come in and kind of piggyback on that. And one of the key things is phone distraction is the main factor. Yeah. At-risk speeding, a pronounced pattern of hard braking. And if you look at insurance and the way it's evolved, this is for the first time with these types of technologies, you have factors that are causative rather than merely correlative. So for example, somebody's demographic or age or income or whatever is a correlating factor possibly with claims, but doesn't cause it.
Right.
Second, these factors are controllable. Like, you can put the phone away. Sometimes people don't even know they're using their phone. It's a part of our body. I mean, I myself am shocked when iPhone reports to me that on average, I spend 4.5 hours on screen time. I had no idea. Yeah. And like, you pick up the phone while driving, and next time you're out there riding your bike or driving, just look around. I guarantee you, everyone at a stop sign or a light is picking up their phone. Yeah. And most people are picking up their phone even at other times. 36% of trips in the United States have significant phone distraction. These are eyes off the road. Yeah. And 11% of that is happening at speeds above 55 miles an hour. This is this is a pretty pronounced problem.
Major safety
And I think
issue.
that if you look at it, telematics allows you to build causative factors, controllable by the user, and it allows for differentiation without discrimination. So, I mean, ultimately, there is differentiation. We are not all equal drivers, unfortunately. We probably could all become one, but that's what the technology can possibly enable.
Super. Okay, well, thanks for that, Harry. So I'm going to turn to Regina Clelau. Regina is joining us from San Francisco?
Yes, that's right.
All right, fabulous. So Regina, as you can see, received her doctoral degree from MIT in 2012. She has founded a very, very interesting company around data and platforms and mobility called Populous. So Regina, tell us a little bit about what Populous is, who you work with, what the company does.
Sure, happy to do that. And I'm going to try to share some slides. I can see in the screen, it looks like those have popped up.
Yep.
Okay,
we're good.
Perfect. Well, it's wonderful to be here virtually. I've had very fond memories of my experience at MIT. I was in the engineering systems division. I actually had my quals written by Hari's sister, Hamsa Balakrishnan, and Chinua back in the day in 2008, 2009. I'm looking forward to being part of this discussion. It's a near and dear topic to my heart and passion over the last 15 years, mobility data, and specifically, how do we make it more accessible and more usable for public agencies to plan for the future? One that's safer, cleaner, and more efficient. When I graduated from MIT, I headed to the Bay Area and was a postdoc at UC Berkeley, where my main project was to build the simulation model for the region, for the Bay Area, to forecast the next 30 years of travel. And it was there that I witnessed firsthand some of the challenges that a lot of public agencies faced as transportation continued to change around them. So Uber and Lyft started service right when I was helping build the Bay Area forecast for the region. And what I found is that from Uber and Lyft to expanding goods delivery, we were seeing more and more congestion, more pedestrian deaths, as Hari spoke to, and continued increases in greenhouse gas emissions in cities around the world, including here in the Bay Area. And that's a big part of why I founded Populous. So it is a smart mobility platform that puts cities in the driver's seat. And we deliver them with digital solutions that they need to dynamically manage their transportation infrastructure. I'm looking forward to more of a deep dive on this topic, but one thing that I thought I would share is a framework that I published as part of a Populous white paper on MOS, or Mobility as a Service, and mobility management. Many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with the concept of MOS, usually referred to as the concept where multimodal transportation services, including shared bikes, scooters, Ubers, public transit, are all bundled into one consumer-facing or traveler-facing app that includes journey planning, book, and pay. Now, one of the things that I think a lot of folks in the industry, even as an academic when I was at MIT and then later at UC Berkeley, didn't discuss is what is the role of mobility management? And specifically on this left-hand side of the system, I describe basically the city-facing data-driven solutions that would actually allow public agencies to help ensure that key societal goals are met. So for example, the ability to price streets, curbs, or subsidize lower carbon modes, including mass transit and micromobility, and then they can define the road rules with access to better data to reduce congestion, pollution, and improve safety. I fundamentally believe that it is by leveraging mobility management solutions that allows public agencies to more effectively deliver incentives and policies to mobility operators, in addition to integrated MOS applications that achieve those public goals. I founded Populous really to put cities in the driver's seat. We've grown really, really quickly, in large part because many cities, with the advent of scooters arriving, began to take a bit more control over how they wanted to see new mobility services operate in their municipalities and jurisdictions. We take in data from over 35 mobility operators around the world, and we deliver that data in over 80 cities. We've processed more than 100 million trips, including from shared micromobility devices, car sharing, mopeds, and then expanded into helping cities manage their curbs with access to better data as well. We are really focused on helping cities deliver a cleaner, brighter, and safe transportation future. And mobility data is a key part of how they're able to achieve their public goals. Thank you.
So that's great, Regina. So your customers in this case are really cities. You're working with cities.
That's correct. Our core customer are cities, usually city departments of transportation.
Okay, all right. I love that graphic, by the way. It really explains it. So we're all so familiar with this mobility as a service concept, but the flip side of that, of what's the value derived from all of these data for cities, I think is a very, very interesting question, which brings us to our next panelist, which is Kirby Olson. Kirby is the new mobility supervisor for the city of Oakland, California. And Kirby, I understand you've been working a bit with Regina and with Populous. Give us a sense from your side, like what was the value here of having access to these data? What did you guys do with it? How has it helped improve or meet your own objectives for the transportation system in Oakland?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, everybody. My name is Kirby Olson, new mobility supervisor, Oakland Department of Transportation. So my job is that I manage all of these shared mobility services that have sort of arisen over the last 5 to 10 years. Our scooter share program, car share, bike share, we had moped share for a while. Early on, at least with scooter share, it was sort of a mess. I mean, people probably remember this period, like 2017, 2018. There was thousands of scooters everywhere that people will say, seem to appear from overnight. And cities really needed to get a handle on how do we manage these things? How do we sort of interject our values into the ways that they're deployed within our public right of way? And how do we, how do we know where these things are? How do we know they're not going where we don't want them to? And then also, how do we potentially leverage them to get some important data that we've never been able to get before? So that's when, LADOT, you got to give a lot of credit to LADOT for developing the mobility data standard, which is it's the language that we use to get data in real time from these shared mobility devices that are floating around our streets, and actually turn that into useful information. So before MDS was created, we've had a program of free floating car share in Oakland, I think since 2017. And what this means is basically there's shared cars that you can access via an app, and they're parked, all over the city, including at metered parking spaces. And so the vendor is called Gig Car Share, and they didn't want their customers to have to feed the meter when they're parked at a metered parking space in Oakland. And so instead, what they wanted to do is pay us for all of the time that their vehicles spend at a parking meter.
Okay.
And so in order to do that, we need the data of where they are, and the data, of course, of where all of our parking meters are, and to do the calculations of how much time they're spending. And so previously, we would do this via spreadsheets, right? Gig would send us massive spreadsheets that have the XY coordinates of all of the parking events, and we would get some interns and some GIS, do our GIS analysis and come up with a bill. And Gig would do the same thing, and then we'd argue about whose numbers were correct. And it was sort of not a very efficient process. And so when we were going to contract for a third-party company to take in data in the mobility data standard, we also wanted to add that process into the mix. And so that's what Populous does for us at the city. So they act as a third party, a neutral third party that intakes data from both car share and scooter share.
Yep.
And they aggregate it for us. They do calculations of things like fees and things like that. And they also do it in a way that protects privacy as well. And so this is another really important factor, and something that Oaklanders are very concerned about. And in Oakland, we have a privacy commission that's probably one of the strongest in the country. And they're very concerned about government surveillance. And so they don't want the government to have undue amounts of information on Oaklanders and their travel patterns. They tend to mostly focus, this commission focuses mostly on the police department, but they also have purview over us. And so one of the really important things that Populous does is take in that data and aggregate it in a way that removes any kind of privacy risk. Because when you have a scooter that's showing the exact location where it's going, you can potentially combine that with other data sources and determine where an individual went, which can, of course, be a privacy risk for them.
Right. So two thoughts here. I mean, one of the wonders of the Zoomiverse is that random thoughts will pop up. And we did see a thought from Jonathan from Qualcomm saying, hey, we haven't talked about trust, and the session is about trust data. So clearly, part of when we speak of privacy, we speak of inherently, we do speak of trust. Right, and so there's a trust that you have bestowed, in this case in Populous, to say this is a neutral aggregator of the data. Am I reading that correctly?
Absolutely correctly, yes.
Okay, all right. And then second, you mentioned Salita Reynolds from the city of Los Angeles and the mobility data specification and so forth. And Salita actually will be joining us on the next panel after this, speaking on a different topic. But yes, it is amazing sort of the progress that we've seen in developing these types of standards for mobility data, perhaps motivated by the unruly proliferation of scooters and then micromobility that landed on city streets a few years ago. So, great comments. I'm going to move on to Stephen Smith. Stephen is the founder and CEO of Coord. Stephen's also an MIT grad. Stephen, tell us a little bit about what Coord is.
Yeah, thank you, John. Delighted to be here, and sorry I can't be there in person, but a lot of familiar faces. And I'm told by someone in the audience that I'm 10 foot tall, so that's cool on the monitor on the screen there. Graduated from MIT Masters, actually was in the computer aided design lab. So first love, ironically, was designing cars. And spent time on that, and I had my first dream job working in R&D at BMW in Germany, but basically realized that to the statistics that were quoted earlier, a billion cars on the road, I think 10 odd years ago, 1.4 now. There are a lot of challenges clearly with that quantity of much as I love the form of cars aesthetically and otherwise, a lot of challenges from a sustainability perspective, safety and otherwise in that number of cars on city streets in particular. And so we founded the company back in 2016, really with this vision of helping cities to manage their streets more effectively, to use pricing among other tools to do so, and really to do that starting with the curb. And so we're really focused on curb management at Coord, and really to do a better job of managing the imbalance of supply of space and demand for that space. Again, back to that stat, as every year there are more and more cars and vehicles in general on city streets. And now not just more in terms of scale, but also scope, clearly, with micromobility, with semis doing store replenishments, and micromobility vehicles, scooters, et cetera, weaving around those vehicles, more e-commerce deliveries than ever, UPS and otherwise, Postmates meal deliveries. Obviously the pandemic has grown all of those sources of traffic. And so it's just basically chaos. And so while we started the company before the pandemic has really, I think, underscored the scale and scope of the problem. Just wanted to share a slide or two, actually, just to explain a little bit more about what we do. So hopefully that's viewable.
Yep.
Yeah, so we call what we do the commerce platform for streets. So again, really thinking about the problem as one of, to some degree, economics. So the fixed amount of supply of space, growing demand for that space, the kind of the logical economics answer for that is to price the space. It's unfortunately not so simple, and so there's a whole set of tools that we have built, which I'll just kind of try to jump into and explain a little bit. So first and foremost, as we started this journey, we recognized that cities didn't have good curb data, and so we built a tool called Coord Collector. Augmented reality-based technology, runs on any iPhone pretty much at this point, that enables curb asset data to be collected very, very quickly, cost effectively, and accurately. City of Boston, I know Chris is here in person. We work very much with the city and have actually supported them with our technology to collect, I think, several hundred curb miles at this point. In the city. Also,
and Stephen, just to be clear, so curb asset data, that is, there is a fire hydrant here, there is a bus stop here. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes. So fire hydrants, bus stops, lengths of paint. So we divide the world essentially into point features and length features. So point features, bus stops, parking signs, et cetera, and the fire hydrants. And then length features like curb cut, like red paint mark along the curb. In the West, their paint is used quite a bit more than in the East because of snow primarily. And so yes, all of the above. So we actually support about 40 odd features now. So we've actually supported work, for example, in Honolulu, where a tree next to a parking space is an amenity essentially in our system and is a curb feature.
For shade.
So exactly. As well as charging stations and the like on curbs as well. So there's a ever expanding list of curb asset types and features that we support. And then we basically take that data, we combine it with the municipal code, parking meter rate tables, and a variety of other things to generate what we call the curb regulations, which are a dynamic thing. So they vary by time as well as a number of other factors, day of week, et cetera, street cleaning and so forth. And so that's data that we derive from the asset data. And then that is surfaced in the Chord web app to help city officials, engineering firms that work for cities, like Nelson Nygaard, for example, does a lot of work for us. They're working on a project in Atlanta at the moment to basically visualize and to analyze and essentially reallocate that space potentially and explore different scenarios. So analytics capabilities for curb managers to basically make changes along the curb and understand what the implications might be. And then also potentially to price that space differently. So layering in not just supply information in the form of assets and regulations, but also demand information in the form of occupancy data, either paid occupancy data, which has some issues in terms of kind of representativeness, but also actual occupancy. And our tools also support the collection of that data. So it's really on the planning and analytics side. We call that inventory management. As I mentioned, we're partnered with the city of Boston on that technology, as well as also the city of Somerville, another neighbor to Cambridge. And then in the last year and a half or 2 years or so, we've pushed forward onto the operational side, where we go from supporting cities mainly behind the scenes, but working with fleets in particular on commercial loading. So creating what we call smart zones in partnership with the city. So we are now live in Aspen and Nashville with what we call smart zones. And the version 1 of smart zones is commercial loading, clearly a hot topic during the pandemic. And so think everything from UPS, FedEx, et cetera, through to larger vehicles doing store replenishments, and essentially operating a turnkey set of tools for cities to actually operate that space. So they can actually charge for the use of that space. So we have a driver app for that. We also have a technology for enforcement that enables the city's enforcement officers to actually to determine if by a license plate recognition technology, if that vehicle has paid or not, if they're part of the program or not. So the program is really focused on commercial vehicles initially. It's kind of the low-hanging fruit.
So you're making revenue. You're generating revenue for the cities.
We make revenue from both our planning tools as well as our smart zones. So yes, with the planning tools as a subscription, and then smart zones on a transaction basis.
Right. Okay. Well, fantastic. I'm going to turn back to Chris. So Chris, you have worked with both Harry and Stephen here at the City of Boston. You are the co-chair of the Mayor's Office for New Urban Mechanics. Maybe say a little bit about what that is and your role, what you've done in transportation. What excites you about what Boston's been doing in mobility?
Sure. And Regina, I know we haven't partnered yet, but it could happen.
Could happen.
So we get everybody else on the panel, and we're learning from Oakland on privacy as we speak. So Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, and I look at this, actually a number of these people know what we do because we've partnered with you too, or you've worked on projects with us in the past.
I think we're trying to get it going here.
I can talk loudly, although that might be bad for COVID.
Yeah, let's just sub this. Thanks, Jim.
So the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics is the civic innovation team for the city, a small team that sort of sits inside the mayor's office and works on prototyping things that are about the future, about delivering better services for people, sometimes about innovating on policy, sometimes about being the landing spot for when the mayor isn't quite sure what to do with a suggestion that comes in from a resident. So in the mobility space over the last decade that our team has been around, We've worked on a lot of the curb management things that the city has been moving forward. We manage the city's autonomous vehicle testing program, which we've collaborated with John on. We get to do fun things like play around with telematics and think about some of the social dynamics that are associated with that and how we nudge behaviors. And currently spending a fair amount of time in Stephen's world thinking about how do we understand this data from our curbs better and then make better decisions based upon that as we think about what a connected and autonomous world could be. So I brought just a couple slides as well, didn't want to be left out of that party, to talk about at least sort of 3 partnerships in that space. So the first one is sort of what Stephen was talking about. On the left side, you see a parking sign in the north end. Pretty legible, right? When you're pulling up to the curb, you know exactly what to do. How many of you, because what Stephen was talking about, I felt like John was sort of asking, like, how many people like didn't know that cities don't know where these signs are? Right? Do people think cities already had this data?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, most cities don't. There's a couple that do, that were ahead of the curve, but most don't. We don't actually know where that sign is. There's a person in the parking enforcement division, Eileen, if you call her, she will tell you where that is. But most people don't know where that is, which means that when we're telling residents, like where to go to decrease sort of circling for parking, the city doesn't have a good way to do that yet. And we also don't have a great way to make planning decisions based on our parking assets. So the number one thing when we go out and talk about a development in a neighborhood and a poor planner tries to convene that meeting and says this development is going to have no parking is pushback from residents, right, that say, well, there's already we're already crunched to the curb, right? And we can't actually say without doing, a study to say, okay, well, it turns out there's excess capacity here, here, and here. The work we've done with CORD is being able to sort of help us do both those things. Communicate to residents about where maybe available parking is and be smarter about how we allocate that curb. So that middle section is what Stephen was talking about, what we see when we send out a whole bunch of interns with smartphones to collect curb data. Actually, in this case, one intern that walked 60 miles over the course of a summer. And then we get all this asset data, and then it turns it into a regulation layer that you see there on the right. We then, from the planning side, the planners in the transportation department can then look at a mix of regulations across a neighborhood, across a couple blocks, and think about, do we have the right allocations of space for loading and unloading, for 2-hour parking, and should we think about pricing as well? So this is the first piece. I'm going to talk about, if we advance the slide, there we go. Sort of a second set of data, which sort of blends in what Hari was working on. So the reason we did Boston Safest Driver was more about a reflection on your own driving behaviors. We were trying to think about how to have a conversation to tell people to be better drivers. 81% of people think they're above average. In Boston, actually, Allstate Insurance has ranked us the worst drivers in the country for 2 consecutive years. So it turns out we're not above average. We are well below. And the thought was, can we use an app like what Hari has developed with his team to have people have that real conversation in their house with their partner or their roommate and actually try to prove that they are a good driver. And that was incredibly useful. We saw uptake of the app in the first, we've done it twice now. Motivation was not the prize money, although we gave out a lot of prize money. The motivation was really proving that they were a good driver. And we saw scores reflect those changes over time. But what's also kind of interesting is that middle map there is some of the speed data that came out of all those people that use that app. Now, Yasha and I wrote a very plain language privacy policy for this that was on the city's website. Yasha Franklin Hodge, who's now at the OMF. We sort of touted to the trust point that city was not going to own any of that data. We weren't going to even see it. It stayed on their servers. We sent a graduate student over to do the analysis for us that we wanted so that we never touched it because the city does not want driver behavior data. We want inferences from that data. So if you can take that speed data, and there's lots of other ways to get that, but from here, you combine it with the crash data that the city already has access to through the emergency medical services, and you lay in sort of this qualitative human perception data. This is residents saying, all those blue dots are places where they think there's something unsafe on the roadway or an incident that they've had, and this is just through a simple sort of website form that they're able to do that and populates. You begin to start sort of amassing a really good picture of maybe where you should make some capital investments to improve safety in a city. All right, last slide. This is sort of a comment not on these policies, but about how you're collecting that data. We've been working with Helpful Places, which is a spin-out from Sidewalk Labs, one of the sort of really positive things that came out of their work in Toronto. No comment on the other parts. But for the civil engineers in the room, this is sort of like an MUCTD to technology on the street. A standardized way of telling people what is out there, why it's there, who has access to that data, and then a QR code that you can scan should you want to learn more. And the examples that we've been trying it out on is sort of our traffic count data that we collect with cameras, where we sort of put these icons on the pole, gives you an idea who sees that video data, what is it being used for, who has access to it, how long is it going to be there, right? And as we continually think about adding and layering in more technologies to mobility, how are we making sure that we're protecting our residents and at a very minimum, being transparent about what's being collected and why, but also how are we protecting that mobility data? And that is certainly at the forefront. You know, you heard City of Oakland talking about that. Forefront of what we're trying to do in Boston too is make sure that we're protecting those movements and that data as we still try to make improvements to the city. So I'll hand it back to you.
Fantastic. So the difference between the yellow camera and the blue camera, which one's less creepy?
One is de-identifiable and one's identifiable video.
Okay.
So I think the yellow, I can't actually, my eyes are not that good from here. The yellow is that you can actually make out who that is. It's at a resolution that you could see it, where the blue you would not be able to.
Interesting concept. Okay, Esteban, any reactions?
Yeah, my first reaction is that we haven't talked about trust.
All right, so
Okay, this is the trust data panel, and we've seen on many applications. And privacy was mentioned, but I want to bounce back to you guys and talk about a little bit about how do you build trust? Because at the end of the day, you are collecting data from users. Even though you are anonymizing the data, even, for example, City Mechanics is anonymizing the data, at the end of the day, you have users which are either building the data themselves or collecting the data themselves or moving around and putting the data out there to be. So how do you actually build that trust with the users? And I guess I will start probably with the city, which is probably the first, let's say, realm in which we have this privacy.
And I'm super curious to hear Kirby sort of take on this too, as a place that has been privacy focused in a goal of trust. There's sort of a quote from folks in Seattle that we often talk about is you can't legislate trust. So you can pass a bunch of ordinances, but does the public actually trust the government is going to use that information properly? I don't know. I think when we've gone out and tried to structure conversations around technology and data, it falls apart when we don't ground it in something they actually care about. And there's small things that cities can do that actually build towards, this is just on the city side, on them actually trusting you with other things like their mobility data. Following up on asks that they have that are related to schools or roadway repairs, right? Potholes being fixed, those types of things start building a relationship and then a trusting relationship. And then you can have that longer conversation about how you build policies in place and make sure that you are explaining those in a really clear way. But I don't think there's a lot of people that trust government right now. We've done a really good job over the last 4 years, 5 years of eroding that trust. So there's it's an uphill battle, I think, for municipalities and states and the federal government too, to make sure that we are being honest when we are collecting data and we are being transparent about what it's being used for, but also trying to ground it in conversations that matter to people.
Yeah, if I can come back to that, I've seen also, for example, working with Nigel in the urban mechanics groups, there are some data which you can collect some data and some data cannot be used for, maybe you can comment on that because there are a lot of mobility data sets out there which cannot be used or might not be used for specific applications.
Well, I guess on that thread, I think there's always a question like, even if we can go buy a data set, does that data set sound creepy when you talk about what it is? Is sort of somebody that we would explain what we're doing with it going to be like, if it doesn't meet that test, we shouldn't even be having that conversation, right? There's a whole bunch of advertising data sets out there that are probably really interesting. We've looked at them, but collecting that data or taking that data and using it for purposes, I think is beyond where we would go. And it's the same thing when we're going to equip a streetlight with a camera or something. Yeah. As soon as we start taking pictures of people, it's a slippery slope.
I'm going to have to move us along because we need to transition to the roundtable discussions. But I'm curious, maybe we'll start with you, Regina. Reactions on trust?
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that we've learned, especially in working in the mobility data space, as the mobility data specification made it a lot easier for cities to ask private fleet operators for enormous amounts of data, is that there has to be a lot of trust. And I think that one of the key challenges that many cities faced, I think, is identifying what were the key use cases or reasons that they needed the data. I testified at a California hearing right before COVID. It was February 2020, where that was really the key topic of the conversation: is should cities have the ability to require data from private fleet operators which contain personally identifiable or potentially personally identifiable information about users and their whereabouts. And what it comes down to really is that there needs to be a reason or a use case for the receiving party of data to have in order to make effective use of that data, number one. Number two, there have to be processes and controls in place to ensure that data is not misused or cannot be used to re-identify individuals. So we've done a lot of work on this topic at Populous. Happy to share white papers and reports that we've written. But overall, I think that at the end of the day, cities do have a lot of very good reasons related to safety, protecting the public right of way, ensuring that climate and transportation goals are met, to need some amount of data. And there are ways to make it usable in aggregated and anonymized ways, which is the primary function that Populous serves. And I would say that we are uniquely trusted, not just by cities, but also by the private operators who provide us with their data.
And Kirby, from your perspective, sort of on the front lines, working with citizens?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when the mobility data standard first came out, there was a lot of concern from privacy groups. I think the ACLU was pretty involved in that, about cities having this massive trove of data about users of scooters and shared bikes. So we really took that into account when we developed our program. So we have a really robust privacy policy as part of our program. And before we went and procured any software to do this, we of course had to go through our privacy commission and show them all of these controls that we were going to have over this data. Number one being, we don't have the data, right? The data is actually on Populous's server, and we can then view it through an online platform. And that's really important because I think something that hasn't been mentioned yet is that cities are subject to public records requests, right? So even if I don't have bad intentions with any of this data that we're collecting, a third party could potentially come in, serve us with a public records request, and get all of the data, and then they could do bad things with it. So because we don't have this data, there's no, bad people can't get a hold of it. So that's a really important part, I think.
Very interesting.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, so we integrated that into our policy, and because of that, in our strong privacy advisory commission, we haven't had any concerns from the public whatsoever about this data. I would say that where trust comes in more for us is actually with the private sector operators, with the companies that don't want trade secrets, basically to be out there in the world. So I think we've largely worked through that on the shared mobility side, but it's something that's going to come up on the commercial delivery side as we move into trying to manage
the next great front, indeed. Stephen, trust.
Yeah. For us, with our focus on curbs, curbs broadly are part of the parking space. I think people generally, it inherits from the parking industry. So I think there's already a lot of acceptance by the public that, well, first of all, to the picture that Chris put up, data about the location and the contents of a sign is not particularly controversial. And so we really focused on digitizing that first and foremost and making that more useful for the city decision-making, as well as the public, including fleets. So that's, I think, a relatively less controversial thing, focusing on the supply side, if you will, in terms of data in our equation. And so it's broadly sort of, we've avoided, I think, a lot of the challenges that others have spoken to on this panel in so doing. And we've partnered also with the OMF. I know Yasha Franklin Hodges in the audience. We announced a CURB data standards initiative last year, or the OMF did. We're very supportive of that, and a lot of work has taken place. Populous also involved on that over the past year or so. So we've tried to kind of learn from the MDS experience and sort of creating a standardized way of talking about CURB data, so that everybody understands data is important, but which data exactly, right?
Yeah.
And how are we defining it? So, and I think that's more of a trust issue, candidly, between cities and private sector operators than it is with the public at large, for the reasons I said before. But I think that's been enormously helpful. But now, as we at Cord start to move more into the realm of operating CURB space in partnership with cities, with smart zones, clearly we now are collecting data about the use of the space by businesses, commercial fleets typically. That is typically less controversial than the public at large. Businesses understand, I think more generally, kind of the usefulness of such data, and they operate obviously with that data as well. And then also, license plate recognition and data about the presence of a license plate is also much less controversial. Like, again, that's been used for years in toll road enforcement, parking enforcement, and other types of enforcement. So that's the kind of usage data that we rely on for smart zones to be enforced. And again, I think broadly less controversial. So we've kind of taken the approach of again focusing on that space first and foremost. And in so doing, I think there's a lot of acceptance already on the part of businesses and individuals, members of the public, to some level of data capture.
Yeah. It's fascinating how behavioralism factors in here, and our attitudes, our values, our perceptions of this issue is evolving rapidly. Harry, I'm going to give you the last word here.
Yeah. With millions of users and sort of an aspiration to get to tens of millions, if not even more, in terms of number of users using this, the trust of our users is the most important thing for us, and privacy is a key aspect of it. So to that end, there are 4 key elements in our approach. First and foremost, try to simplify the terms of use, so users can understand it doesn't require like a law degree to understand what the heck's going on, and encourage our customers to do the same thing. A great example is what we did together in the Boston Safest Driver, but even our insurance customers, just make it really simple. The second is align our business model so that privacy could be used as a business weapon rather than as a problem to be overcome. What I mean by that is to make all our business decisions something where it is a competitive advantage for us. So ours is we get paid by an insurance company a certain monthly fee per user, and so we actually say we will not share, sell, or monetize the data in any other way. That's just part of the contract that we establish with our users, and we put into our contracts. It's right there. And this is something we view as a competitive advantage because not everyone in our space, not all of our competitors is like that. So we think actually privacy as a weapon, positive weapon, because it's the right thing ethically, but it's also, frankly, it aligns our business that way. So that's a good thing. Third, we work quite closely with various consumer groups, the Consumer Federation of America, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the ACLU, and others, to craft these policies. So we also explain insurance is a regulated business. So it's important that consumers adopt it. They are, consumer groups have a pretty significant voice, and we work with them. We want to explain to them. So when somebody comes and says there's a magic black box algorithm, we can't tell you this, our approach is by contrast. I've been on calls where I describe the algorithm because these are complicated. We just want to give you what data is being used, what's the output out of it, be more transparent. And fourth, we did constitute an external privacy board to guide us. The chair of the board is Dr. Danny Weitzner, who many of you know from MIT. He's an expert in both law and computing. Other members are Professor Oren Kerr from Berkeley, who's one of the experts in Fourth Amendment law in the U.S. Kathleen O'Toole, who was the police commissioner in Boston and Seattle, and she has a really nice perspective balancing law enforcement, privacy, and other uses of the data. And Professor Van Eek with a European perspective, because we're in 20 countries and do that. We've also arranged for various certifications. We have an ISO 27001 privacy certification, probably one of the first tech companies to obtain that. So it's something we take seriously.
Yeah.
But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think if we, A, understand that we are users too, and B, line it up so our business model views privacy as a opportunity, as an opportunity to make, to leapfrog the competition rather than a problem to overcome, I think we'll produce the right outcomes.
Well, I can see you've thought extensively about this. Those are 4 very, very specific items. Okay, what we're going to do is our friends online are going to continue the discussion in their online Zoom room. We're going to do the roundtables here. We're going to be super fast, all right? So we have got, let's say, about 12 minutes. I'm going to ask the folks who are over on the side to consolidate in. We have some really great people here. Joshua is here. David is here. Please come on in and let's have a quick conversation about what we just heard.